Do you think the one-party state is a good model? Because the outcome of that one-party state is also massive human rights violations across the board.
I mean, I don't think that, I think that America is a one-party state.
I don't care about
To say that America is a one-party state in the way, and I assume like the one party is capital. To say that America is a one-party state in any way comparable to the way that the Chinese are a one-party state is absolutely ridiculous. I don't want to spoil my brain before I get into the talk, so let's listen.
create a pretense to take anything you want, you know.
Yeah, but there are also, but you agree, like, for example, the federal government in the Civil War did the right thing, right? It was very violent.
Wait, where somebody sent me this timestamp right here. Is this where he starts on this, or is it earlier? It sounds like they started earlier.
Characterizes fascist, I would point to Russia before I
agree 100%. I think that Russia is a significantly better example of a fascist nation state, given its modern Russia, contemporary Russia, being a capitalist nation state built by oligarchs that were anti-Soviet and anti-communist, that made deals with Western bankers and Westerners originally, leading up to the dissolution of the USSR, so they could literally pick apart the entire country, Vladimir Putin being another primary example of this.
Okay.
Man, is that really all where his comparison, like, man, I really think his knowledge of modern Russia is really shallow. If I was to talk about Russia being fascist, right? I mean, I guess corruption and oligarchy could be part of it, but I would say that's, in the grand scheme of things, a smaller aspect of it. I would probably lean more into, you know, trying to fight imperialist wars of expansion, cracking down upon any dissent, sexual minorities, and in many instances, national minorities as well. A lot of talk of the elimination of the national enemy, the minorities that are corrupting the great Russia, the Christian Russia, with their degenerate fake identity, the Ukrainian identity. We must erase that identity off the face, the face of the earth. This kind of rejuvenation of the Russian idea, which is a kind of a mid-19, I think it was 1850s or 1860s, mid-19th century idea from very nationalist Russians who were scared about the modernizing world, about Russia turning away from feudalism, and believed that the modernizing Enlightenment and all of the democratization and the parliaments that were being introduced and a lot of these crazy Western ideas and Catholicism were going to come to Russia and hurt it and change it in a way that would be damaging to Russia and its great character, its moral character, and its Christian nature. Its Christian traditional nature, and therefore Russia has a destiny to push back against that degeneracy as almost like God's chosen nation in Europe. I can't describe all of it because there's different philosophers who have different ideas of the Russian idea, but these are all very, I would say, fascist tendencies ideologically. It's not as simple as businesses control stuff and oligarchy. A lot of people don't talk enough about the ideology. When I talk about Nazi Germany, and I talk about what made Nazi Germany fascist, you can talk about the Nazi economy, right? You can talk about the corporations and the relationship with the government, but in the grand scheme of things, I would expect the chapter on the Nazi economy when describing Nazi fascism would be maybe 5% of a book about it, maybe 10% of a book about it. When you talk about the ideology, the demonization of Jews, that's a very large part of it, and that's not talked about as much when we talk about Russian fascism. Like, maybe you'll talk about like a few arrests here, a few arrests there. People say, oh, it's just politically repressive, but people don't talk about the reactionary politics of the pseudo-czarist Russian government. Anyway, continuing.
Good, they're fascists.
I would agree that Russia's interests are significantly more fascist than the outcomes are, because their interests do not lie around improving their productive forces or the abolition of like what Russia's doing in Ukraine is no different than what America has done in Iraq. Like,
it's very different. It's extreme. I mean, they're both bad, but these things are very, very, very different. Very, very, very different. One is a territorial expansion based on the idea that Ukrainians aren't real and that their national identity is fake. And the other was not territorial expansion. It was an imperialist invasion of a country that we lied about. But we're not saying Iraqis are fake, or we're going to erase Iraq off the face of the earth. We're going to nuke Iraq and wipe it off the face of the earth. And if anybody stops us from invading Iraq, we'll blow up the fucking world. And Iraq is going to be cleansed by America's Christian guiding light. There were a few American politicians that talked about the Christian guiding light and versus Islam. And that was probably, I would say, the most, where you could find the most fascism related to the Iraq War, is when you get into the weird theocratic sentiments around some administration officials in the Bush administration. But these are two very different wars. These are very, very different wars. They're both bad, but I mean, that's like saying, I don't know, like, ah, man, my cancer and my glaucoma. God, man, they're just like the same medical problems. It's like, yeah, they're both bad, but these are very different things.
Like, oh, we're bringing democracy. Like, they're not denazifying Ukraine. It's fucking bullshit.
The Russians are not invading Ukraine under the premise of, okay, whatever. I'm just gonna.
Whereas I will not say the same thing about like Tibet.
Well,
like,
no,
I
I'm not saying one
I
is
think it
better
would be a
than the other.
disservice. I think it'd be a disservice.
So is the comparison is that he's saying that makes it just like the invasion of Iraq, is that the invasion of Iraq was based off of lies, and the invasion of Ukraine was based off of lies. On that level, I guess you could say it's similar. But, I mean, most imperialist wars of expansion are probably based in some extent lies.
To Ukraine to make a comparison between like modern Ukraine and feudal Tibet.
You can create a pretense to take anything you want, you know.
Yeah, but there are also, but you agree, like, for example, the federal government in the Civil War did the right thing, right? It was very violent, but they did the right thing.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's talk about Taiwan then, because Taiwan in its formation is created by the KMT, or KMT General Chiang Kai-shek. I'm butchering his name.
I think that was close.
But I think it's the closest I can get to that. And it's
Chiang Kai-shek.
in its formation, it was a military dictatorship that was fascist, openly nationalist, and there was no surprise there that the American government was backing them, right? In its entire inception. Taiwan now is very different than that.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about it.
But this is very important in the context of like talking about Taiwan.
So should they be invaded for how they were
Absolutely
founded?
not.
Right.
Absolutely not. Because hey, guess what?
Everybody was
when America builds you up to be a nation as a counterbalance or as the real China, as we did originally. That's why we were in support of Taiwan, because they were nationalist, fascist, military dictatorship that was brutal, comprised of dudes that got owned by fucking Mao. Overall,
we supported them because they weren't communists. That's why we supported them.
Right? At a time when, and at a time when, yeah, 100%. At a time, and they were butthurt losers that believed that like Mongolia is also a part of Republic of China. They have more expansive desires, more expansive territorial desires than
Mongolia.
Well, they can't do anything.
Well,
their military, according to American generals' assessments, was fucking dog shit.
It was. It absolutely was. Unbelievably corrupt. The thing is, in the 1950s, the Dwight D. Eisenhower administration wanted to pull support for Taiwan. They're like, look, at the time we didn't even really call it Taiwan. It was the nationalist government. I was like, look, these guys suck. They're losing the war against the communists hardcore. They're unbelievably corrupt. A lot of their generals are extremely incompetent. Like maybe we should pull support. And it was Congress who actually got in the way, because in Congress's mind, what, we're going to abandon our World War II allies? Oh, as communism is marching across the globe, we're going to abandon them. And so they continued to fund what was then just nationalist China, what is now referred to as the continuation of the Taiwanese state. We continued to fund them with Congress leading the way and Eisenhower taking a back foot up until they were pushed off into the island.
I think Taiwan's a better example then.
But also, that was like 80 years ago. The government of Taiwan is completely different. The ruling party of Taiwan right now is the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the opposition party to the KMT, which is what he's talking about.
But wait, I'm not ready.
But Taiwan in its
This
inception.
tangent is out of control.
Wait, but like you want me to?
We'll go back to it.
These things don't happen overnight. If you assume that it's like a war between good and bad, or that it happened overnight, it materialized out of nothing, then yes, that is infinitely more susceptible to Western framing to be like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, they want to do this thing, and then you make comparisons to like reasonable wars or whatever, and then all of a sudden, we are not factoring in the understandable, whether I agree with it or not, doesn't matter, the understandable desires of national security from the Chinese nation state that...
Wow. You know, I hear national security used like a buzzword all the time, but most of the time when I hear, and that's not to say that there's never a good way to use the word national security, right? There is a good for example, the Tommy Tuberville blocking of like army officers right now. That is an actual national security problem, because if we don't have army officers, the army doesn't work. If you don't promote army officers, you're holding them up from doing a good job in the army. Like, that is a national security issue. If you can't appoint a new Joint Chiefs of Staffs, who's going to advise the president on military matters if we're in a crisis, say like some massive like terror attack, or I don't know, whatever it is. Like, that is an actual national security issue. But when we talk about national security, the legitimate concerns of national security of China, what is the fear of national security from the Chinese government when we're talking about Taiwan? Is it a fear that Taiwan is one day going to land tanks across the coastline and march to Beijing and overtake the government? Is it a fear that they're going to start launching missiles and like hitting the coastline? What is the legitimate national security problem? If the problem is, well, we don't want American bases in Taiwan, well, there's already not American bases in Taiwan, or if the problem is we don't want American bases in the region, then the solution would be, let's negotiate a de-escalation of the Taiwan and Chinese Strait. Let's de-escalate the amount of bases that we both have in the area. Let's de-escalate the amount of militarization that's in the area. That would be the solution. But their solution that they continue to stand on and they have yet to remove themselves from is invade and conquer Taiwan if you do not decide to peacefully rejoin. If it's a national security concern, I would like to hear what it is.
Is in an openly...
Because what we're deciding is that Taiwanese freedom or Taiwanese sovereignty or their desire to build a separate nation state where they have things like civil liberties, which Hasan himself has said he acknowledges that the civil liberty in China is dog shit, and he prefers the civil liberties that we have in the United States. And I would assume he would say that the civil liberties in Taiwan are much better than the ones that they have in mainland China. That's something that the Taiwanese people fought for. And when I say fought for, I mean fought and died for. Many of them died in the white purges of Chiang Kai-shek and his son, fighting for freedom of expression, fighting for freedom of the press, fighting for the civil liberties that they have now. And I don't think that the descendants of those people, or the ones that are still living and survived those purges, want to readily give those freedoms away. And that's why rejoining with China, rejoining with the mainland, is a more and more minority and radical position that even many of the most conservative members of the KMT would not state openly.
Contentious, yet still very favorable trade relationship with the Western world. Why the fuck would they want a American military base in a nation state that was developed by America, originally a fascist, nationalistic, brutal military dictatorship?
Okay, you can say that's what they originally were, but this isn't 1950. This is 2023. America in 1820 was a slave state. I mean, if you're talking about the first industrial complex, but was a slave state, a chattel slave state. Now, if we were talking about Mexico's relationship with America or Canada's relationship with America, if Canada was to come out and say, America is a slave state, it is a slave state, they keep black people in chains, that wouldn't make sense when trying to engage diplomacy. We got to invade America to free the black people from slavery. No, that's hundreds upon hundreds of years ago. You wouldn't achieve anything. If the Chinese were to invade Taiwan, they wouldn't be getting rid of fascism. They wouldn't be getting rid of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. they'd be getting rid of a, quite frankly, a flourishing democracy. So I don't know why that would be relevant when it comes to an invasion of Taiwan now. If it was an invasion of Taiwan in 1960 or 1970 and Chiang Kai-shek was still in power, I think this argument would hold a lot more water. But the year is 2023.
Why would they want that to be an American?
Also, he says an American military base there. If they don't want it to be an American military base, then maybe they shouldn't threaten to invade them and make the Taiwanese think, hey, maybe we need more military arms, maybe we need more support from the Americans to protect our sovereignty. If you threaten someone endlessly, naturally, they're going to want to go and defend themselves. If I got 1 million death threats tomorrow from different people saying, I'm going to go kill you, Dylan, I'm going to go kill you, Dylan, and showing pictures of their home, and they start driving up to my front door and looking at me and doing this, and I don't think anybody would be that surprised if I went and got a revolver to defend myself. The logic there makes sense.
American base 1 mile off their fucking coastline.
Okay, you're right.
So that is precisely the reason. So that's precisely the reason why the people of Taiwan who recognize that reality, while they yearn for independence, they recognize that reality that it will never happen as long as China has a military or a powerful economy, and as long as America has a legitimate interest in Taiwan being an American base of support to inevitably control China, dominate China in some ways.
So wait, what's Hasan's solution? I would actually like to hear this, because it sounds like from the way he's framing it in the second part there, that Taiwan's solution is, the solution here is for America to pull back and stop selling them weapons, stop giving them the means to defend themselves. And so then the Chinese will calm down and then back off of their threats to invade the island that is integral to their state ideology, that has been a part of their ideology since, you know, the communists took over mainland China, and they've been trying to do it since then. And the reason they haven't is because we were there. And so we leave and then what? What does that solve? What does that fix? Besides just making Taiwan weaker and making it easier for the Chinese to invade.
Okay, hold on. Let me go back, because we did like the monster tangent.
Like, again, if there was a deal made where we demilitarize the region and China demilitarizes the region, starts disassembling the artificial island, stuff like that, even if it wasn't complete demilitarization, just partial militarization, like we had the START treaty with the Soviets, and we started to cap the amount of nukes we had, and started to remove warheads from missiles to reduce the effect of things like human error. But that was great, even if it didn't completely demilitarize the region. We could even do something like that. But that would be, I think, a legitimate solution. Undercutting Taiwanese defense, just what does that accomplish outside of just undercutting Taiwan's defense?
Here.
Okay.
I was saying one of the reasons China's so effective is because of their one-party state. You know, without opposition, they're able to move fast and effectively. So do you think this is a good model? Do you think the one-party state is a good model? Because the outcome of that one-party state is also massive human rights violations across the board.
I mean, I don't think that, I think that America is a one-party state.
I don't care about
To say that America is a one-party state in the way, and I assume like the one party is capitalist. To say that America is a one-party state in any way comparable to the way that the Chinese are a one-party state is absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Let me just, 15% of Congress is against sending aid to Ukraine. That 15% of Congress, through strong-arming Kevin McCarthy, is currently threatening a government shutdown of the entire country, furloughing federal employees, possibly millions of federal employees, closing down 500 national parks across the country. What else? What other effects? I wrote down some of the effects the other day. I took some screenshots of what some of these effects would be. 1 second. Let me actually roll this up. Roughly 850 to 2.1 million workers could be furloughed. Social Security, Medicare, checks are sent out, but benefit verification and card insurance would stop. SNAP benefits, agricultural department may only be able to send out assistance for 30 days after the start of the shutdown. National parks, over 400, I said 500, sorry. Over 400 national parks across the country will be forced to turn away visitors. Air travel. Air traffic controllers and TSA agents are ordered to work without pay. These are some of the effects of a federal shutdown. And that's done by a very small percentage of Congress. A very small percentage of Congress. If we are a one-party state, why is the government shutting down? Why are they able, through a lot of procedural through a bunch of procedural motions and other tricks, able to sabotage Kevin McCarthy this way? If it was a one-party state, then Pentagon funding, which is where a lot of this is tied up in, would basically be certified, clicked, and then done. Done. We resolve the matter. As they just described, a one-party state is brutally effective. You know, debate is kind of pushed to the sidelines as effectiveness and quick action are prioritized, even if that will lead to, you know, a lack of checks and balances. And so if somebody engages in tons of corruption, they might be able to get away with it quite easily. It's hard to call them out when the government has control of the press and will lock up dissidents. But in America, there is no one-party state in the way that he's describing. And I mean, in the way that we're talking about it in China, that does not exist here. The government shutdown we're talking about right now in the United States, have you ever heard China being like, you know, 15% of our legislative branch is really angry about this one Belt and Road Initiative project that they think is wasteful. So we're going to shut down the government for who knows how long until they cave. How that wouldn't happen in a one-party state. That doesn't make any sense. I'm not saying that Republicans and Democrats don't agree on certain things, and many of those things being things that are really bad. Well, so for example, a lot of Democrats will protect drug companies. Kirsten Gillibrand, even though she's no longer a Democrat, but she was a Democrat, is the person who sabotaged our drug negotiation legislation we were trying to push through in order to try to make it so that the government could negotiate tons and tons and tons of drugs to lower the prices for seniors and elderly people. She was the one who pushed back upon it, tried to make it so there'd be no price negotiation whatsoever, because she got hundreds of thousands of dollars from drug companies. I'm not saying things like that aren't bad, but when we talk about the one-party state in China, and then you say, America's a one-party state too, as if these two things are comparable, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's completely disregarding the differences between our political systems.
America.
No, but it's important to understand, because like the one-party state is an inevitability under any kind of formation of the government. The government is going to yield results that are either positive for the people or negative for the people.
Even if it's marginal, there is still a difference. Even if it's marginal, there's still a difference. For example, abortion.
It's not even marginal, man. It's not even marginal. Ukraine is, I mean, of course, it's something I focus on, but marginal is a great example. It's not marginal. Ukraine is a great example of how it isn't marginal. The NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, and the not the legislation, but the new regulations that have been put in by Biden's NLRB, which makes it so that if a company union busts, there is no election. There is no, if they're trying to union bust to stop a union election or to undercut a union that is trying to form, there is no election. There is no process. The union is formed and now they have to negotiate with it. No questions asked. That is a gigantic win for workers. And that's just one of the achievements of the Biden NLRB. There are others as well. For example, the big win on overtime pay. Compare that to Donald Trump's National Labor Relations Board, which was headed by a union buster. These differences are not marginal, they're significant. I wish that they were more significant and they went further. But describing the United States as a one-party state, it's just silly.
Which I consider a human right. It's marginal.
I agree with you.
Look, if you want to make a statement like America's the one-party state and the one party is capitalism, okay, everybody can snap and clap for you, little poetry circle. Congratulations. But we're comparing it to communist China right now. It is not a one-party state in any similar way whatsoever. There are real differences between politicians in office. There is a real press that can criticize both Republicans and Democrats. There's freedom of the press in the United States. That is how we always held ourselves to the best standards? Have we always succeeded in holding ourselves to standards of freedom of the press? No, even from the starting of this nation. I think it was the second president of the United States that tried to crack down on the press. But we fight for that, and we've won a lot of victories for that, and now we have a relatively free press, certainly in comparison to China and their one-party state. No, it's not comparable.
On that, I think that
But I don't want to talk about America. I want to talk about China.
Well, the reason why we're talking about America is to put it into a framework that is understandable. Like, that's the only reason why I always bring up. People always say, Hasan, your only assessment on the situation is America bad. It's significantly more nuanced than that. The reason why I always go back to America is to help Americans or Westerners understand Chinese governance.
Ah, yes, because the Chinese government is just like the American government. There's as much dissent, there's as much stoppages, and you just come on, man. He's not even trying. #1 political streamer on Twitch. You know what this feels like? You know how a lot of foreign policy people interested in foreign policy or commentators on international affairs will constantly compare everything to World War II. And I'll do it pretty often too. I try to do it less. I try to compare, different wars to other wars. But the reason they always do that is because everybody's familiar with World War II. But the problem is, some things that happened, there's just not like an equivalent to compare to World War II. And so what people will do in order to try to compare it to that thing that everyone knows about, they'll like twist around the analogy to a point that it no longer really even works. And so it's not wrong to compare different foreign policy issues to World War II or different wars to World War II. But if you're doing it to the point of bending it around just to try to have something that the viewer back at home has some idea about, you could end up actually misleading them or misinforming them about the true nature of the international issue you're talking about, as Hasan is doing now in reference to the United States. Because China is a different country than the United States. It has a different history. It has a different geography. It has a different ideology. It has a different system of governance. And so certain things in China is just going to be basically impossible to compare to the system in the United States because it's a different system. It was built to be different than the system in the United States.
I understand what you're saying.
Not all that different.
You say they don't just pretend to have two parties.
Yeah.
Now, I disagree with that. I don't think it's like super, super wrong. I think there are marginal differences in the parties. And I do think there's space potentially, although super. If
America is a one-party state, if this is true, then it doesn't matter if Donald Trump, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, any of these people win. Because if it's all a one-party state, it's all the one-party line at the end of the day, then why does it matter?
Unlikely. It's happened in American history for a third party. It's probably never going to happen again, but it has happened before.
Yeah, the Civil War.
And so, but the consequence of
the greatest material differences. Okay, but the greatest material differences were ever represented in American history was during the Civil War.
I take back the
Okay. The greatest material differences, like genuine material differences in the form of how to produce cheap commodities like cotton, okay? Well, in the northern states, they backed the abolition of slavery. Southern states didn't. That was a major point of contention. That was probably one of the last times where there was a real and significant difference in an agreement, I guess, a difference in opinion that led to a very violent conquest of the South that wanted to secede and was forced to not.
The one-party system in China does result in a lot of human rights violations. Does the ends justify the means in that case?
I don't think so.
Control.
I don't think it does.
Okay.
I think that in Cuba, which also has certain restrictions on civil liberties, for example, there is a better argument to be made that the ends justify the means in Cuba, because Cuba is an island that has been under embargo, and since its inception, since the Cuban Revolution, after we backed Batista and wanted to ensure that Cuba was still a tourism destination and sugar plantations with slavery, and then lost, we immediately said, okay, fuck this shit, Cuba, we are going to do everything in our power to stop you from developing. In that situation, because it's a tiny island nation that is in the ass cheeks of the largest imperialist superpower on the planet, it's understandable to have certain restrictions on civil liberties, whereas or not. And by the way, ironically, Cuba is like way better on abortion, gay rights, and whatnot, which we can get into if you want.
No.
But that's a consequence of direct democracy, even though Cuba is a one-party state as well.
Okay.
Like,
I mean, there's plenty of I know plenty of I'm not, and again, I'm not super familiar with the politics, so I don't even want to speak on it necessarily, just because I don't know a lot. I do know that a lot of Cubans that I've met fucking
A lesson Hasan should learn. I don't know enough about Cuba to really comment either.
hate the Cuban government.
yeah, because they're in America.
They're not like rich. They're like
No, it doesn't matter. They're
okay, so they're
like they don't have to be rich. But they're in America, which
No,
means
Oh, also, Cuba's not a direct democracy. I'm not very educated on Cuba, but I know that Cuba's not a direct democracy. Anyway, I heard that he talks about Ukraine more at 02:43. Like, we can go forward to that. We don't have a lot of time today, so I don't want to just listen to them ramble about Cuba or other issues. I want to focus on the things that I feel like I might be able to contribute to in some way. I don't want to pull a Hasan.
said that they would not support an independent Taiwan. And
but that's propaganda.
what? No, but that's the American policy.
70 years ago.
Would
There's
have
so much though. There's so much you want to. Okay. We'll do 40. We'll do 40.
Because the northern states are able to improve their conditions, have favorable trade deals with the rest of the planet, they inevitably get to a point where they want to maintain their hegemony, they want to maintain their security, their national security. Do you think it would be appropriate? To rock the boat per se and allow the South to continue developing and continue having a massive military and inevitably, like, you send envoys like Nancy Pelosi to Southern American states to fucking say, hey, look, they're democratic now. Like, yeah, sure, they were designed around slavery, but they have a democracy now, and I think that it's okay and appropriate.
This comparison is so janked from the start because, look, all I'll say is this. If the South got rid of the slavery and all of the human rights abuses, then that wouldn't be the Confederacy anymore. I wouldn't have problems with my main problem was with slavery and human rights abuses in the South. If they got rid of all the slavery and the human rights abuses, I'd be fine with Nancy Pelosi going down there to drink tea. Yes, I'd drink some sweet tea and have some time in the South. But they would never do that because it was founded on that. Or if they did do it, it would only be because it was no longer profitable, and most likely would not get rid of the segregation that would come afterwards. There is no equivalent to that in Taiwan today. So, I mean, I feel like just this. I just don't like this comparison.
To fucking keep building their military, make it as robust as possible.
By the way, the South seceded just because we were talking about it. It was like 3 months between the war and the.
But leading up, the build up to that was significantly longer.
Yeah. Okay, so I understand your position on Taiwan. I get that. I get all that. You know, from a.
But
I don't. The one country, two system thing is silly though, because.
But living in California, you personally understand it, right? Like, living in a blue state, you understand why that would be like genuinely like, you would understand how blue.
It's like, I'd be like, Taiwan is just like Nazi Germany. Like, would you be okay with Nazi Germany if they got rid of all the Holocaust and all the anti-Semitism and all the dictatorship and all the human rights abuse? Like, well, yeah, if you get rid of everything that makes Nazi Germany, yeah, I guess I'd be fine with non-Nazi Germany, as in like modern Germany.
Blue states in America would have security concerns if, like, southern states had seceded successfully.
I agree.
And kept saying, like, no, the rest of America is ours. Mm-hmm. After they fucking lost too.
Well, I mean, this was.
If the South said that while we all knew that they had no ability to do anything against this, what is left of the United States, because there's just such a differentiation in military power, then if I was the United States, I would either largely ignore it or just keep enough of a standing army to dissuade any attempt. And we all know that the Taiwanese are no longer serious in any manner about reconquering China itself. That is a position held by the most minority of our minority, like Chinese nationalists left in Taiwan. Nobody is under the delusion that they're going to land tanks on the shores of China. And the Chinese are also not under that delusion. That's why all their plans aren't, how do we defend against a Taiwanese invasion of China? It's, how do we invade Taiwan? That's a good way to see who's really a threat, is how they plan their wars. The Chinese are planning to invade Taiwan, not defend from a Taiwanese invasion.
70 years ago, that Taiwan, that the
Yes,
separation
Taiwan now
happened.
is not a fucking fascist.
How many people live in Taiwan? 25 million.
I don't think
military
I don't
state.
think that how it was founded matters at all.
70 years is not significant in development. It's, of course it's
That's my point.
no, it's what do you mean?
I don't think that you should be like, oh yeah, Taiwan
70
was a
years
bunch
is
of
a blip.
losers that went and started their own country, and like so they're not entitled to a national identity. I don't think that matters.
70 years is a blip in time in as far as like
The majority of the Taiwanese population, though, were not alive when the nation was founded like that. And when you talk about young Taiwanese people who were born in a democracy, have only known the democracy, I mean, the world is moving on. If you look at the Taiwanese public, ask them if they want to bring back the regime of Chiang Kai-shek or his son. In fact, I saw footage recently, I believe it was of like Chiang Kai-shek's family members, their descendants, apologizing to some of the victims of the white purges with tears in their eyes. The country has, even though it hasn't completely atoned for the crimes of the regime, is starting to go through some process of acknowledgement of what the regime did wrong, and certainly they have evolved past that regime.
as far as talking about a fucking
So, I mean, look, that history is still important. Of course it's still important. But the country of Taiwan, the government in Taiwan is nothing like what it used to be.
empire or a history that spans over like
I don't care, but that doesn't matter, right? We're talking about human beings.
yeah, and now they are democratic, which is great, and I understand their want in autonomy and not being under like some form of crushing civil liberties that the Chinese
But
state
the
will bring.
one country, two systems isn't
Yeah.
real. That's not a real thing.
What do you mean?
It's not a real thing. It's one country, one system. Like at Hong Kong, that's what they want to do. They say Taiwan, we'll do the one country, two systems, but that's propaganda.
What do you, no, but that's the American policy, which they did with China. They have
Right.
America said that they would not support an independent Taiwan and that Taiwan is a part of China. But internally, Taiwan
Okay, I feel like Hasan is being like he's like purposely not responding here. I'll let him finish though, but I feel like he's avoiding the question on purpose.
still has autonomy, which is what is currently happening, and the Chinese state sees it as a autonomous region that is still under the Chinese banner that ends up getting military support from Western forces.
That's when people talk about one country, two systems in Taiwan and China. They're not referring to the fact that they both claim to be China, but they have two completely different governments. What is being referred to is an offer by the Chinese government, which is we want to do with you what we did with Hong Kong, which is allow you to come back into the national fold. We will take over governance of your island, but you will be allowed some democratic trinkets. Of course, that's not what they say. They don't say democratic trinkets, but that's what it becomes. Just really the frills of democracy and none of the actual democratic, like no actual democracy. If the government is handpicking your candidates and they're striking people off of the rolls for protesting against the government, they're arresting people for booing the national anthem, people disappearing in the middle of the night. When you say one country, two systems, I do believe it's really one country, one system. And that's what the offer really is, as we saw in Hong Kong. And that is what Ethan is trying to get at.
Let's talk about.
He's saying that the offer that the Chinese government is making isn't serious, and we can look to Hong Kong to see what one country, two systems meant in actuality.
Ukraine, and then that's my final one.
Okay.
So we were talking about Ukraine, and your position was that the support for Ukraine is 100% manufactured.
No.
That's what you said last time.
No, I think that all matter of American foreign policy is greatly influenced by manufactured consent because of our interest in, doing whatever the fuck we want to do there, whether it be like bringing Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence or it's not genuine because they want like genuine emancipation for Ukrainians.
So
Okay, so America, of course, has its own interest. The government has its own interest and is going to try to influence the public debate through, hearings and press officials, like press hearings with the press and a relationship with the press. They're going to do their best to try to make the press report on these stories in the way they would want them reported, flattering to them, as all other democratic governments, or all governments do, period, right? And there is, I do believe, people in the press that work with the government on certain occasions to do that. And there is a history of the CIA having a relationship with the press, and there is real things, a real tangible history there that can grab onto. But when we're talking about building a consensus amongst the American public to get involved in any foreign policy conflict, it's really difficult to find the line of like how much of this was because the government is doing their best to go out there and make a good case and influence the media in a way that benefits that government's interests, and how much of it was just natural grassroots rising from, the people. I've seen a lot of online activism that is extremely grassroots when it comes to Ukraine. I meet people at rallies and events in favor of Ukraine, people who go work and trying to get those on Capitol Hill, lobbyists who've been working on issues related to Ukraine for years. I believe they have a genuine interest, either born from their time in Ukraine or born from learning about the conflict. I think part of the reason why Ukraine has gotten so much support isn't because the American government made a good case. I think it's because the Ukrainian government made a good case. The Ukrainian government is led by a movie star. And while in most instances I would scoff at the idea of celebrities running countries, when you're talking about having a good PR campaign, a celebrity's really good at hosting a good PR campaign. And he's done very, very well at trying to get at any event where more than 3 people have gathered and tried to speak at it. Whether it's the Oscars, whether it's a joint session of Congress, no matter where it is, he's constantly making that case. Constantly making that case. Now, it is true that the American government and American interest being at play is going to lead to the American public and the American press focusing on that more, but that's true for every country on the planet as well. Whether or not American interests are at play in Ukraine doesn't impact necessarily whether or not it is moral to support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia and struggle against the invasion.
Oh, so last time you guys compared it, you said, well, nobody gives a fuck about Georgia when that got invaded. Therefore, the fact that anyone cares about Ukraine feels like manufactured.
It's not even just Georgia.
Well, you guys know that, but you guys realize there's like a massive. I didn't know anything about the Georgian War. I learned about it. There's a huge difference. You guys understand?
Well,
that.
I mean, the scale is.
It was a 5-day war.
Yeah, it was 5
They
days
expected Ukraine to
versus-
drop in 5 days, and if it did, we probably wouldn't be talking about it. Because
That's true. That's true.
so like what happened was Ukraine mounted this miraculous defense, and they've got Russia, a fascist country.
Did he just scoff?
Ukraine mounted this miraculous defense, and they've got Russia, a
I'm not gonna read too into it. I'm probably just I'm paranoid.
fascist country on the back foot, and we all like when fascism.
I don't think Russia is on the back foot. I think it's just like extending the harm.
Well,
What? Wait, okay. Is this the new take? A new Hasan take I haven't heard before? Okay, let's listen.
I don't think Russia is on the back foot. I think it's just like extending the harm and only furthering
we
conflict.
inflicted so much, and I stand with the Ukrainian people because I think Ukraine is a force for good in the world. They're on.
Can I just stop you for a second? Because you said 100% manufactured consent. Like
that's
nothing.
what.
Okay, so I think they're going to move off of what Hasan just said, and Ethan not grabbing what he just said is a big failing on his part, in my opinion. Because he just kind of slipped that little detail in there, and then they're kind of moving on. And I feel like this is the kind of important thing Hasan just said. I think it indicates that he wants to maybe cut off aid or cut off support to Ukraine.
on the back foot, and we all like when fascism.
I don't think Russia is on the back foot. I think it's just like extending the harm and only furthering
we
conflict.
inflicted.
So I don't know what he considers on the back foot. Okay, maybe we have different standards when it comes to on the back foot. Maybe he would expect like a continuous collapse of the front line is the only way you can describe a country being on the back foot. But let's just describe some facts about the war. Okay, let's describe some just things that we know are facts. First fact, Russia has lost over 50% of the territory they have captured since the 2022 invasion. Second fact, Russian government revenues, due to a combination of sanctions and unbundling their economy, has lost over 50% of government revenues. 50%. Oh, big 50. That's a lucky number today if any of you guys does the lottery. Military spending has increased by 100 to 200%. They have lost well over, and this is just visually confirmed losses, over 2,000 tanks, when according to the Pentagon, they've increased their tank production to 200 a year. And that's visually confirmed tanks, and that's a report from May, meaning that visually confirmed, it's probably gone up by hundreds more. And the total number, according to the Ukrainian government, is much, much higher if you're including the things that we don't have public social media posts made online, because that report of 2,000 comes from visually confirmed reports from offset accounts. So that means stuff that's been public. And a lot of these bombings and attacks are probably not going to be posted online for security reasons or intelligence reasons. But point is, they've lost tons of their stockpiles of old Soviet armor, some suggesting that they've lost 30 to 50% of their armor stockpiles. The Russians, due to the fact that they've overextended themselves, were unable to stop a mercenary of rapists and murderers from prisons, a mercenary army made of rapists and murderers, street thugs, with a just plain criminal culture that they got to inherit from their prisons. So we're talking about basically gangs with tanks sent towards Moscow, shooting down Russian airmen out of the sky, killing 20 of them, shooting down Russian command aircraft, shooting down Russian helicopters, marched to Moscow, and then they had to negotiate with them when digging holes in the street didn't work. The Russian government has had to abandon Armenia, whether because they don't care to stop the Azerbaijani invasion, even though Armenia is within their defensive alliance, and they said they would defend them in the past. Either, now there could be two reasons of doing this, either because they don't care, or, and I think this is a likely contributor, they can't. They can't fight a two-front war right now. I think, you know, I just talked about World War II comparisons earlier, but a war on two fronts is not fantastic. One of the big conclusions from the war on terror is that invading Iraq after invading Afghanistan and straining American resources was a big contributor why we got our ass clapped. Fighting a war on two fronts is not smart. You'll stretch yourself thin, and they've already contributed so much of the resources into Russia. What happens if we get another rebellion in Kazakhstan, as we did a few years ago over the cutting of gas subsidies? What happened, which is in, by the way, Russia's security alliance, and it was Russian troops that stabilized the situation last time. Could they deploy another 15,000 to 20,000 to stabilize the situation? What if Kadyrov dies, as there are a lot of rumors about his health, and that quote-unquote uniting figure in the Caucasus is gone, and violence starts to spiral out, under the idea that the Russians are just not as strong as they used to be, which they look. Internationally, Russia is on the back foot. They invaded Ukraine in order to stop the expansion of NATO, and NATO has actively expanded. Finland has joined, doubling NATO's border with Russia. Internationally, they're on the back foot. When it comes to the original goals of the war, they're on the back foot. Now, I assume when he says they're not on the back foot, maybe this is in reference to the recent counteroffensive, which is penetrating the first and second lines of defense, but who knows if they'll penetrate the third or if they'll be able to expand these penetrations enough to take crucial locations like Tokmak or go to the Sea of Azov. But for every single D-Day and operations to take Berlin, there was an Operation Market Garden. Or, because this isn't that type of disaster, there are still real gains that the Ukrainians are making, an invasion of Sicily. Tough, grinding battles that are necessary for liberation. I just don't know why he is so quick to say the Russians aren't on the back foot. They're certainly on the back foot internationally. They certainly have basically missed all of their expectations for what they wanted to achieve in this war, and they're currently being pushed back. Slowly, but they are. Now, that doesn't mean that Ukrainian victory is guaranteed and the Russian collapse is inevitable, but the Russians have been clocked, and they're not down, and there's not a referee counting them out, but their legs are wobbly. You ever seen, you know, a boxer get like the deer on ice type of legs during a fight? That's what Russia looks like right now.
So much. And
Let me just to clarify, because I want to make sure I don't give you guys too much opium. That's not to say Ukraine doesn't face issues. Obviously, Ukraine faces issues with its air force, not having enough jets to protect its skies. Ukraine does not have domestically a sustainable anti-aircraft and missile and drone production enough to stop the bombardments, and that's why it's reliant on Western aid. In fact, Ukraine's main weakness, outside of a lot of like old Soviet era military doctrine and management that is not helping the country, is probably the West and possibly a lack of resolve from people, quite frankly, like Hasan.
And I stand with the Ukrainian people because I think Ukraine is a force for good in the world. They're
Also, can I just say, Hasan, I think, has this blind spot too, but this isn't even just like Hasan criticism. This is a major criticism of, I think, 90% of the press that talk about this war. There is very little discussion about what happens if we freeze the contact line like many people want. There's not much discussion about what happens if we reach a settlement where the Russians get to keep all the territory they hold, or if we were to really just cave to Russian demands, because there's a decent chance we come to a negotiating table, they think they smell blood in the water and say, we're not caving unless you give us everything we annexed. Thing is, they've declared annexing not only the land they currently hold, but also the city of Kherson and the city of Zaporozhye. And so if they're going to demand that in negotiations, do you actively hand over to the Russians even more territory to make a deal? This is a question that I don't think Hasan has answered. I don't know if he would answer it, but there's very little discussion about what type of violence is well known to have been happening since the start of the occupation and to continue to be happening in occupied territory. Whether it is the deliberate, and this was produced recently, and I know it sounds hyperbolic, but it isn't, whether it is the deliberate murdering with small arms fire children not only who are running away from Russian soldiers and they're no threat because they're actively scared of them running away, being shot in the back, them in car seats in the back of cars trying to get to hospitals, them trying to evacuate, children being murdered, whether it's the mass graves that have been uncovered in occupied territory. In Izium, they broke a record, the largest mass graves since the Yugoslav genocides, over 440 bodies. Whether it's the quote-unquote cleansing operations they did when they occupied Bucha. Do we think that type of brutality has just magically gone away and it isn't continuing in occupied territories? That these stories of disappearances in the middle of the night, of people's bodies just appearing mysteriously miles away from their homes after the fact, that this comes from just thin air? That these families weeping over their murdered children and murdered family members in occupied territory, not just over the last 2 years, but during the last 9 years of occupation in locations in Crimea or in the occupied Donbas. When people talk about peace, they talk about the aesthetics of peace. They talk about, wow, everyone, the soldiers directly on the front line have stopped the majority of fighting. If we just freeze the contact line, there's a decent chance it's just going to look like what it looked like for the last 8 years, which is a frozen conflict with intermediate shelling that civilians still die from, and would be extremely difficult to deal with issues like demining and God, man. It's just such shallow analysis. There's so little thought into the after the fact when Ukraine falls out of the headlines. What happens to Ukraine's economy, which is going to be permanently crippled when you cut off 80% of their coastline that they need to ship grain, a country that's the breadbasket of Europe. Shipping grain by rail, which they've been able to do during the war to still get their grain into international markets that will stabilize prices and help their own farmers and their own economy, that costs 4 to 5 to 6 times more than shipping it by water. So we're talking about farmers possibly, if the Ukrainian terror campaign against grain shipping, the Russian terror campaign against grain shipping continues, we're talking about farmers permanently increasing their transportation expenses for 30 to 40 to 50 to 60%. We're talking about much of Ukrainian society, once martial law ends and Russian bombing campaigns possibly continue through a ceasefire like it did during the last 8 years, a lot of them just leaving the country, going to Europe permanently. The country has already lost around 50% of its population since 1991, in large part due to the Russian invasions. We're talking about permanently, demographically crippling the country. It just gets worse and worse and worse and worse the more you learn. Dylan, it sometimes feels like you're a broken record whenever you react to these idiotic foreign policy takes. I mean, I feel like I'm the only one talking about it. I'm not the only one talking about it. Ukrainians are constantly talking about it. But there's very few people talking about the after the fact when they talk about freezing the contact line. There's very few people that actually say, okay, this is what we'd be willing to give the Russians. Yes, you can have these villages. Yes, you can have sovereignty over these people that you're currently dumping in mass graves. There was an executive order passed, I believe 2 months ago. I would think it was 2 months ago when we covered it on the channel, where Putin made it so they can just seize the property of anyone who doesn't accept a Russian passport in occupied territory. If you don't give the Russian government your fingerprints, photographs of what you look like, and accept a Russian passport, disregarding your Ukrainian national identity, and not sending your kids to their Russified schools, then your property can be taken away and you could be forcefully deported or arrested. You couldn't even just live with, like, in peace by yourself, living as a Ukrainian separate from the Russian occupation, just in your village in the middle of nowhere. That's not an option. They are pounding their national identity into the Ukrainian people. That is what they're doing. This isn't as simple as we're pushing back against NATO and we're just scared of NATO invasion. There is an ideologically reactionary, hyper-nationalistic, imperialist, and, as Hasan has acknowledged, fascist motivation behind the occupation. If Hasan acknowledges that Russia's a fascist state, why would he give Russia control of millions of people? What happens when you give fascist states controls of millions of people that they openly say they say aren't real and that they need to wipe out their national identity? I'm not even talking about the type of rhetoric from Russian government officials or Russian state media. I mean, we covered that story a few weeks ago about Russian state media programs talking about if the genetic impurities of the Ukrainian population could have infected Russia proper when they deported Ukrainians from Ukraine into Siberia, and whether their genetics got into the Russian population and made them weaker, and that's part of the reason that they're not finding success on the battlefield. If you pump that type of propaganda into the heads of soldiers and then tell them to rule over the people that they despise, you're going to get horrible human rights abuses. You're going to get stories like we've covered on the channel before of people being executed extrajudicially, as we've seen time and time again in this war. When people talk about freezing the contact line for peace, they're not talking about peace. They're talking about the aesthetics of peace.
Can I just stop you for a second? Because you said 100% manufacturer consent. Like,
that's what you said.
Nothing is genuine. I said 100% manufacturing consent is a leading role in this.
If you want to amend
and the reason why
fine.
the reason why I take issue with this is because it's like stating like I don't give a fuck about Ukraine. Of course I give a fuck about people in Ukraine. I want the war and the bloodshed, the unnecessary bloodshed, to end.
That's it though. He just wants to hear, the war is over, and then forget about it.
Okay. My assessment on the situation might deviate from NATO bloodthirsty NATO defenders or whatever
You
the
feel
fuck.
like we shouldn't even be doing anything in Ukraine?
No, I don't.
Nothing.
No, I don't. I think
You
that
don't think so? You
no,
think
I think that of course there's a necessary intervention
Yeah.
that must happen. I'm not
okay.
saying
So he is in favor of aid? What is it? Okay, but what is his intervention? I want to hear details. What the hell? I'm getting a call. Stop. Jesus Christ. I don't know why I'm getting called during stream. Oh, sorry. That was Zelensky. He's telling me I'm not chilling enough. I'll try harder.
that at all. I mean, I've fucking raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Ukrainian refugees. Like, I'm sorry, this is such a silly fucking thing that, like, not from you, but I hear so much from dipshits online.
Well,
who just want to fucking cut
this
propaganda.
Is good, so you can say exactly
Suck my
what you mean.
dick. You know?
So you do.
Dude, he slips up on the issue constantly. He said that if he was wrong about Ukraine being invaded, it would be a Tim Pool style 49 state landslide mistake. He makes the mistake, and you know what? We all make mistakes. We all make mistakes. It is what it is. But the problem is, he followed up with more mistakes, just making up war crimes. Like, well, you know, Ukraine bombing the Kerch Bridge is a war crime. There is no human rights lawyer, there is no expert on war crimes or international law that would assert that bombing the main supply line for your enemy in a war is a war crime. No one would say that. No one. But he did. I don't know if it was an attempt to both sides it to show, oh, both the Russians and Ukrainians do war crimes. But he keeps making the same mistakes, which I think are primarily just from either a lack of knowledge, which is, I think, the more charitable interpretation, or because he needs to find some way to say that to stop sending aid, to stop sending the support.
Do you believe that America's actions in Ukraine are the right ones?
I think that America's actions to a certain degree in Ukraine is understandable. It's reasonable, certainly what the Ukrainian people want, but I think America's interest in Ukraine is not genuine. It's not genuine emancipation. It's more so a continuation of the bloodshed,
Well,
which is
who cares
demonstrated
if
not
they
by me, but by
It's not genuine emancipation. It's through a continuation of the bloodshed. How do you gain emancipation? By legalizing the occupation of your people. I don't...
by American politicians like Chris Murphy, who have openly said on the record that for 5% of our military budget, we've been able to cripple a foreign adversary's military budget without a single American service member dying in the process. I would say that that is profoundly successful. What are we doing in Ukraine? We're sending our refurbished old weapons and weapon systems to Ukraine. We have to replenish those weapon systems. It's a never-ending cycle of...
Okay, because the reason I ask is because...
But then wars end. All wars end.
There seems to be a somewhat of a...
I think a lot of this is lefties hate guns. It's primarily guns made for war. I mean, they're okay. Lefties are okay with like Second Amendment guns. They hate sending weapons. They hate manufacturing weapons. They hate the military-industrial complex. And since they hate that, and that's bad, anything that benefits them is bad. But every nation in the world has some sort of a military-industrial complex. And there are people in that complex everywhere in the world that profit. We just have the most powerful and most influential one. It's horrible. It's engaged in horrible stuff. But just because the hammer salesman is a corrupt piece of shit, that doesn't mean that when you have a nail, you just stick your head up in the sky and you're like, oh, no, we don't need a hammer. We don't need a hammer. Think about all those other times we thought we needed hammers and we used hammers because the hammer salesman said we needed it. Nope. No hammer is needed. No hammer is needed. We don't need weapons to fight off the illegal invasion, conquering, and a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Not necessary. Not necessary.
a sentiment in the left.
But I will say that the interests as to why we're involved in Ukraine are multifaceted. There are interests that are selfish from American interests, and there are interests for certain lobbyists that are more, I would say, humanitarian, or because they care about Ukraine. I've met lobbyists, in fact, many of them are my friends, who go to Capitol Hill, talk to politicians about what American aid is doing on the ground to try to liberate the country, because they have a genuine interest in their country being liberated. And are we really going to say that when AOC or Premia Jayapal or any of these other like lefty congressmen, when they vote in favor of it, they're doing it because, oh, they just love the military industrial complex? Or do they think, man, I'm voting for this aid because I don't want to see Ukrainians dumped in mass graves?
Circles or social, I don't know how to even describe it now. I don't know. But that the proxy war, people say, in Ukraine is unjustified.
It is a proxy war.
No, I know, but they're saying we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine and the whole.
I don't like the word proxy war when describing the war because it's usually used to remove the autonomy of the Ukrainians, because it makes it sound like we're making the Ukrainians fight on our behalf when it's not necessary, when the Ukrainians are the ones that want to fight the most, more than the American public, more than American politicians. The Ukrainians are the ones that want to push out the Russians more than anyone. If we're just saying that we are also sending aid to Ukraine to serve our own interests and it's a proxy in that way, then okay, that's true. But I just often hear that used to remove the autonomy of Ukrainian people.
Yeah,
Russia should just take Ukraine. And
no, I can't speak for other. I can't speak for other leftists. I don't know what the fuck they say, but plenty of those people also despise me and say that I'm like not pushing Z or whatever. So it doesn't fucking matter.
I thought I heard Richard Wolff have some kind of thing like that.
I can't speak on Richard Wolff either. There's disagreements that I have with Richard Wolff. He had
okay, so you're down with what's happening. Down with what's
I'm not down with what's happening in Ukraine because I want the bloodshed to end, and
I'm against war. Clap.
Only way to do that is by bringing China to the table, bringing America to the table. The real actors here.
You think Ukraine should make some secessions to Russia?
I think the original 6-point plan that was a continuation of the Minsk Accords that were tried twice and failed twice.
Wow, that sounds like a successful model. Let's do that again. Let's do the thing again that the Russians constantly violated and led to the largest war in Europe since World War II. Sounds like a successful model. We should try that again.
Would be a far preferable situation than like endless bloodshed over, inches of territory where...
Inches of territory. You think if I went to like where Hasan lives and just said, oh, this town is like, I don't know, this whole town is, it's Saudi Arabia now. What do you mean it's Saudi Arabia? I mean, they said, we had to give them the town or, they would invade. But what do you mean? It's just inches of territory. But to the people who live there, it's the homes that they've lived for the entire lives. There's going to be people who could possibly be trapped there or killed, that they'll never see the light of day again. And that's not an exaggeration. We know that's happening. It's not just inches of territory. Could you imagine, like, D-Day, what, for miles of territory? What are we what, miles of land? Again, with World War II comparisons. Like, yeah, but territory also has people on it. It's not just the territory, it's the people that are in that territory. Let me demonstrate something. Recently, there was a Telegram post from a Russian nationalist that really caught my attention. They were talking about the children in occupied territory and what languages they signed up to learn in school. And 47% of those in occupied territory signed up to learn Ukrainian. What interested me, this is the Zaporozhye and Oblast. What interests me is that a very large percentage of people left occupied territory as the Russians came, whether in convoys, like humanitarian convoys, or just they loaded up the car and they skedaddled because they knew when the Russians took over, whether they had ties to the government or ties to the military, or maybe they were civil activists, LGBT activists, or something like that, that could lead to them being killed, imprisoned, put through the filtration camp system, any of those things. And so they make the decision, bad idea. Or maybe they're just fleeing the fighting. But the vast majority of those people who fled are going to be people who identify as Ukrainian. But of the people who stayed, 47% want their kid to learn Ukrainian, and they're willing to fill that out in a form that they hand to the Russian government. Imagine what the number would be if it wasn't the Russian government asking for that, by the way. But they complain about it. And in the post, they say, this sucks. How could it be 47% that still want to learn that devil tongue? And we need to do something to deal with this. But that shows that at the very least, half of the population in occupied territory, and that assumes that every single person who filled in Russian had no fear as to what their reaction would be if they said their child wanted to learn Ukrainian. We have to assume that all of those people are actually genuine, that they want their kids to learn Russian and not Ukrainian. And that also assumes that somebody wanting to learn Russian necessarily means that they support the Russians, which isn't necessarily true. There's a lot of Russian speakers that I know that are against the Russian invasion. In fact, some of the most ardent Russophobes I know speak Russian. So that shows to me that there is a significant amount of people that we would be abandoning to permanent occupation, permanent repression, to being strangers in their own towns, villages, and country, to have their national identity robbed from them. And that's if they're lucky and they don't end up like the others in the pits. Again, it's the aesthetic of peace. That's what people want. Just like the last 8 years after the Minsk Accords was the aesthetic of peace.
You know, people are
I'm not saying that there shouldn't be negotiations, but the hard questions for Hasan is going to be, what should the Ukrainians have to give up? He's just saying, oh, inches of territory. It's like, okay, we're going to give up multi-100,000 of people cities. We're going to, all those people just going to live in occupation forever. Or the people who are going to leave in a mass exodus, they're just going to have to give up their homes, their towns, and villages that they've lived in for generations. Leave their wealth, leave their jobs, if they still have a job. The unemployment rate in occupied territory is atrocious. There's just so much of this that I feel like is not thought out.
being fucking slaughtered
I don't
endlessly.
think the Ukrainians would describe it as inches of territory.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, you're saying they're fighting over inches of territory. I don't.
He's just saying in the context of how stagnated the war has become. Like the back and forth is pretty much ground to a halt at this point, and it's
This
just,
is what I
it's
mean.
a
It's like a
bloodbath.
very
I'm, you know what? General moderator. Okay, I didn't know we had a military expert in the room. Look, I'm not a military expert too, so I shouldn't be too facetious. Facetious? Facetious? Whatever. When people say ground to a halt, I want to know what exactly they mean. I assume they mean the Zaporozhye front. I assume that's what they're talking about. Maybe they're also talking about the Kharkiv front. They can't be talking, I mean, the Bakhmut front is relatively active. They can't be talking about that. The Ukrainians launch a counteroffensive to retake the entirety of the Kharkiv Oblast, smash all expectations, blazing success. They then launch a counteroffensive to retake the only provincial capital that has been captured by the Russians for the entirety of the war, the city of Kherson. They win that. They recapture over 50% of the territory they've lost since the 2022 invasion. But because this specific counteroffensive is not going at the same rapid pace speed as the rest of them, now the war stagnated. It's going to be trench warfare forever. It's just going to be an endless grinder. There's no end in sight. This is an endless bloodbath. If this is how we described wars anytime you found any bump in the road, we would never win a war. We wouldn't have won the revolution. We wouldn't have won World War II. We wouldn't have won any war. What Hasan and everyone else wants is for us to continue supporting Ukraine, is Ukraine going into every battle just miraculously performs miracles. Just smashing counteroffensive after smashing counteroffensive with no delay and no time to break through the entrenched positions. And I know that none of them are going to come out with the critique of, well, actually, maybe the Biden administration should have sped up shipments so that the Ukrainians could have conducted this counteroffensive faster, so it would be easier to smash through less defensive positions. I never hear critiques in that way. Man.
cynical interpretation of what I'm trying to say. It is inches of territory physically when we speak about it.
But I think Ukrainian people get angry when they hear you talk about it because
they get very angry when he talks about it. The reason I was banned from Hasan's Discord was because I interviewed a Ukrainian and they critiqued Hasan. A Ukrainian whose father was murdered by the Russian army. They had a lot of critiques for Hasan's dialogue about Crimea, for his statements about the invasion. They basically said he was uninformed and that he didn't know what he was talking about. I never even messaged in Hasan's Discord, and that got me banned by his moderators. It's not just that, Ukrainians don't like when he talks about it. It also feels like he doesn't want to listen to them.
they
That's
Not just him, but also his community. And that I will stand by.
understandable. I mean,
they
I get
feel
it.
like you're
They want full-throated
the
support.
Russian
They want and expect
more.
full-throated support, right?
They expected the anti-imperialists to support a liberation struggle. If we talk about like the Algerian struggle against French colonialism, I don't think Hasan would have been like, this struggle has been going on for many years. The Algerians need to throw in the towel.
They understandably want that. And they want more than that. They also wanted Article 5. They wanted full NATO protections and NATO nations.
They don't like.
They are not requesting that NATO troops go on the ground and fight for them. Zelensky said in front of a joint session of Congress that they have no interest in American soldiers in Ukraine dying and fighting. Joe Biden has said multiple times he has no interest putting American troops on the ground fighting. Zelensky has said time and time again that he would like to fight in Ukraine, even though it's a difficult task, will fight this war for all of Europe on their behalf. They will take the majority of the bombardment so they can achieve their own liberation, but they would appreciate their support in that struggle. There was a few statements at the start of the war, but you also need to remember that the Ukrainian government at the start of the war is going to be trying to pull every trick out of the book to save their country from annihilation. And it is a war of national survival. But since then, the position has consistently been that they have no interest in American troops, or even if they did, they know it's not going to happen. American troops and NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine fighting, and so send them support. And that has been the position.
Like that you say that they should cede territory to a fascist invader.
It's not even secession of territory. It's like prior agreements that neither party has held on to. The real Ukrainian criticism in this situation comes from people who say, well, Hasan, how can you say that when Russia has not held on to their obligations? And that is true. Russia has not held on to their side of the bargain.
Okay, by the way, when we say they haven't held on to their side of the bargain, right? Let's just highlight, let's do like a crash course of a few, okay? Let's do a few. Russia declared after the collapse of the Soviet Union that they would not invade Ukraine. In return, Ukraine would give up its nuclear arsenal if Russia declared that it respected its territorial integrity. In 2008, Vladimir Putin declared to the world after invading Georgia, and everyone was very scared, that there's no ethnic issue in Ukraine and that Crimea is a part of Ukraine's territory. A few years later, he invades Crimea, denies it the entire time he's invading it. This is after a Euromaidan protest, which happened in response to Russian coercion, economic coercion, trying to force the Ukrainian government to agree with his trade deals, even though the Ukrainian government wanted to agree with EU trade deals, and that's what the majority of Ukrainians supported. After he invades Crimea, he then invades the Donbas while lying about invading the Donbas and supplying the Donbas rebels while lying about supplying the Donbas rebels, and would only admit to having troops in the region when one of his soldiers was captured by the Ukrainian government and flaunted around for the international community to see in 2015. Then there were all the violations of Minsk I, all the violations of Minsk II, and then you come to the great year of 2022 when the Russians built up forces on the border, said it was a free training exercise, then claimed that Ukraine had weapons of mass destruction in the form of chemical weapons and biological weapons that target Russian DNA, released a bunch of false flag videos purporting to show Ukrainian soldiers invading Russia proper, which was then later revealed to just be Russian soldiers dressed as Ukrainian soldiers crossing the border that was already in occupied territory. Literally Germany invading Poland shit. I don't know if you guys know this, but when the German invasion of Poland happened, they said Poland attacked them. And the way they did it was having German soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms and attack German positions. And then the Russians invade. And then during the invasion, they have time and time again violated agreements they themselves have set, whether it has been corridors that they have fired upon, war crimes that they continue to deny. And I'm only talking about like the modern stuff, the modern examples of this. For the last 8 years of fighting, there have been many examples of corridors that have been formed where the Ukrainians were told that they go through that then become a shooting gallery. Just so many instances of backstabbing, time and time again. And of course the Ukrainians are not going to buy it. So why would we expect the Russians, with nothing to enforce a ceasefire and nothing to make them respect it, because the only thing this government seems to respect is force, is power, is somebody that basically points a gun at them and says, fuck off. Why would they stop? Why would they not lick their wounds, invade again when they're more prepared and all you've done is buy the Russians times to kill the Ukrainians more effectively. That is a good critique. But also, what was the other thing you said?
That neither party is.
They don't like that you say that they should secede territory to a fascist invader.
It's not even secession of territory.
No, Ukrainians also 100% complain about him asking for the secession of territory. When I interviewed Ukrainians and they talked to me about why they didn't like Hasan, that was actually the main thing I heard.
It's like prior agreements that neither party has held on to. The real Ukrainian criticism in this situation comes from people who say, well, Hasan, how can you say that when Russia has not held on to their obligations? And that is true. Russia has not held on to their side of the bargain on the Minsk Accords, but neither has Ukraine. And my point is,
Well, it's not even worth it.
ensuring that with an international
I don't know
cooperation
anything
is
about that accord. What is that?
the Minsk Accords.
What was Ukraine's violation? I would like to hear it. Was it the moving back of heavy weapons? I mean, why would you move back to heavy weapons when the Russian soldiers never left? Whatever.
Were, so this again goes deep into fucking history, and you can't always say like, oh, I don't know the history, so I don't know, and then repeat like mainstream media propaganda.
Let's also say the Minsk Accords also were forced on Ukraine. Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 was forced on Ukraine.
You know?
Well, I don't.
Okay.
I don't know anything about it.
Ukraine as a nation state has
And that's what we're trying to do again. We're now talking about forcing Minsk 3 on them. A system that has proven not to work. Let's see if let's do League of Nations Part 3. Let's see if that works. Third time around.
has even
You know, maybe Germany should try to conquer the world a third time. I'm sure it'll work this time.
predated, or some form of like Ukraine has predated even the Russian nation state, or the Russian Empire, I guess. And its nation state development project has always hinged on excising Russian influence. However, under the USSR, Ukraine, which was called the Ukraine originally, which just means like the border, okay, was...
Oh my God. Look, if anybody wants to, I don't have much more time to talk about this, so I want to hear as much as I can. But if anybody wants to hear somebody talk about this at length and get angry about this and this specific thing that Hasan has said before, just go watch my interview with Anna about Hasan. He probably expressed it a lot better than I can.
Seen as, I mean, had plenty of Russian sympathetic people that lived in the eastern regions. And that sympathy only grew the further east you went, the closer you got to current existing Russian territory.
Sympathies existed for Russia, but do sympathies for Russia necessarily translate into I want to be Russian? There's a lot of sympathies for Canada and Michigan, but if you ask Michiganders if they'd rather be Canadian than American, most are probably going to say absolutely not. And there was no data showing that the majority of Eastern Ukrainians wanted to be Russians. None. There's zero data showing that. None of that data, and all of the data that does purportedly show it is only after the occupation period, when, you know, there's a brutal occupation that suppresses dissent, where everybody who disagrees with them has fled for fear of their lives. It's like if I went into a town after declaring I'm going to kill all the people who disagree with me, and then I'm like, hey, nobody who disagrees with me is here anymore. I guess they always wanted to be part of my collective. Like,
Now that is no longer the case. Make no mistake, I'm not saying that at all. And that is no longer the case almost entirely due to Russia's actions in that area. Like, blowing the shit out of Kharkiv is going to make sure, is the fastest way to make sure that there's...
This is true. He's right here. I got to give him credit for that. That is true. That it is. When I first was coming to Ukraine, one of the things I was advised to, I think it was by Michael Hillard, with Redline. He advised me to go to Moldova if I wanted to interview refugees, which I interviewed a bunch of refugees in Poland, because there was a lot of Eastern Ukrainian refugees in Poland who were in shock that Russia would do this to them.
There's no sympathies for your government whatsoever, ever again for the rest of your life. So that's all gone away. But originally the contention was LPR and DPR, through Russian influence, and this is the Ukrainian assessment of the situation, these two areas wanted autonomy and were getting backed by the Russian government.
They did. When he says they want autonomy, there's like, whatever. What does he mean by they want autonomy? As in, after everybody who disagrees with them has fled because of the terror campaign, now the ones that are left might be 60 or 65% of autonomy, when beforehand, when everybody was living together, it was 70 to 80 to 85 against, or whatever.
And Western involvement that wanted to keep Ukraine in
When he says autonomy, what does he mean by autonomy, or whatever?
the sphere of the West did not want to give the actual protective assurances, to Ukraine, but wanted to play the delicate balance of like saying, you know what, yeah, maybe we'll get you into NATO, maybe we'll get you into NATO with no real interest in getting them into NATO, maybe we'll get you into the EU,
So how did
with no interest in
Ukraine
getting them
violate
into
their
the EU.
agreement?
What?
How did Ukraine violate their agreement?
There was mass shelling on both sides, like back and
You're talking
forth
about the current
shelling.
war.
Did you know, I heard this recently, I gotta go check this, but you know, there's a town in eastern Ukraine called New York, and I was told, this might be complete bullshit, so these with a massive grain of salt, but I was told today, while I was eating with a journalist from BBC Portugal, and he told me that each 9/11, during the 8 years of fighting in the Donbas, the Russian separatist forces would shell New York on exactly 9/11 as like a cynical joke. I don't know if any of you have heard that story before. I gotta go double check it. Might be complete nonsense, but man, I love spreading misinformation on the internet.
No. Back and forth shelling that has been happening since 2004.
Okay. So it was a
That with
non-aggressive
13 or
agreement?
14,000.
But like, this is the problem. And when he talked to Ukrainian forces who were fighting during that period, this is the assessment they'll give you is, yeah, we were shot at, and then we would shoot back, and then we'd get calls from Kiev telling us to stop shooting, you're risking the agreement, and then the Russians would keep shooting at us because the Russians don't give a fuck. And so either we stop shooting and we get hammered and just hold on for dear life, or we shoot back.
People dying.
Okay, so anything about
So it is true, that is a violation of the agreement. But if one side isn't respecting the agreement, why would you respect the agreement on the other side? And again, this all is besides the fact that this agreement was forced on Ukraine.
Totality. So that is, so at the time there was a agreement called the Minsk agreements. There were two versions of this, which neither side agreed upon, which meant that LPR and DPR would still remain under Ukraine, but would have autonomy. Okay. And Ukraine understandably did not want this because that would mean that Russia would have an outsized control on Ukrainian affairs and Ukrainian politics, which it already did through Russian loyalist leadership that they had. That was obviously squashed because there's always been this back and forth between Western influence in Ukraine, wanting to move them into the Western sphere of influence, and Eastern influence, Russian influence in Ukraine, which wanted to maintain Ukraine's status and wanted to change Ukrainian affairs.
Okay, so they were both.
Wait, they wanted to maintain Ukraine's status and change Ukrainian affairs. What do you mean maintain Ukraine's status? Because I would say that what the Russian government was doing in 2014 by trying to strong arm the Ukrainian government into pulling out of this agreement with the EU and entering a different agreement with Russia was not them trying to keep the status quo. It was trying to force Ukraine to join Russia's camp. I don't believe that Russia was ever really interested in a neutral Ukraine, at least not the current Russian government. I think it was always a game to see how long it would be until eventually they would move on to Ukraine and make sure it served Russian interests. And this is what the Russian government has already stated multiple times, that Ukraine can only exist as an extension of Russia. So it's not even like, oh, I'm guessing that's their intention. They've said this multiple times since the invasion in 2022. It actually was in Putin's speech that started the whole war off.
Both attacking each other, and you think the attacks were equally provocative. And again, I don't know anything about it.
I think that
He has no clue. He has no clue. He has no clue about the attacks. I'd like him any of the shell. He probably, this is the extent of the knowledge. He knows that the Russians shelled and he knows the Ukrainians shelled. That's the extent of his knowledge. I've never been more sure about anything in my life.
this was another instance of proxy war, 100%.
Okay.
He didn't answer the question. He didn't answer the question. What was that? Listen to Ethan's question.
Equally provocative. Okay, so they were both attacking each other, and you think the attacks were equally provocative. And again, I don't know anything about it.
I think that this was another instance of proxy war, 100%.
Okay.
What was that? He was asking, that the Russians and the Ukrainians during the Minsk agreements were attacking each other, violating the Minsk agreements. And those were equally provocative because he wanted to know, like, was it that the Russians bombed the Ukrainians and they shot back? He was asking for specifics. Smart on Ethan. Then he responds with like an answer to something else. I don't know. I don't even know what that was in response to.
Like, there are people who wanted to be a part of Russia, and at the end of the day, though, like, the reaction from the Ukrainian government to that was understandable. They wanted to protect their own interests. They wanted to protect their own borders. They wanted to protect their hegemony. And
they wanted to protect their people. But all those things do, but they wanted to protect their people.
And national security interests. But there's a difference between, like, what they did in Crimea, for example, and what they did with LPR and DPR. What did they do in Crimea? There was a referendum. People say it was bullshit referendum. It was under gunpoint, which is understandable to say that because that is what happened in Crimea. But Russian territorial claims to Crimea Russian territorial claims that Crimea had more historical prescience.
No, they don't.
And the highest level of support for Russian expansionist policies.
There was more support probably for the annexation in Crimea than in the Donbas, but we don't have evidence that it was the majority. You can't just walk in and take things over and then afterwards, once you have everyone at gunpoint, hold a referendum and be like, wow, everybody loved it. After everybody in the opposition fled. I've interviewed the people who fled Crimea after the Russian takeover. They were terrified for their life. They were terrified for their life in many instances. And the ones that stayed saw Crimea transform from the place he grew up in into an environment that was extremely more politically repressive than anything they were used to, and that was completely hostile to the Ukrainian national identity.
In Crimea specifically because of its military base that the Russian military operated out of, okay?
Like if America invaded like a province of Mexico, because they've said, well, and even if there was like 10 to 20 to 30, who knows what percentage of people in there who want to be part of America, that is not how you settle international affairs. You go in and you take and you say, this is mine now because I heard some people here want to be part of America. That's what the Germans said about the Sudetenland. That's what the Germans said about Austria. And we all, looking back at it, can be like, yeah, actually, the way they did that probably was pretty busted and should have been some warning signs about their intentions down the road. And again, World War II comparison. Everything's World War II.
And what did Ukraine do in that situation? They cut the water supply. They immediately fucking broke a dam, a USSR-era dam that was offering supply, like water for the Crimean citizens that they said they, cared about.
You're talking about that recently? That happened?
No.
That happened back in 2014. After the Russians took it over, they cut the water. Yep, they cut the water supply. I'm against that. That's one of the big things that I am actively critical of that the Ukrainians did at that time period.
That dam has been destroyed when Russia invaded Ukraine.
But essentially, I wanted to clarify.
Like they cut Crimea off, and not in the same way that they wanted to deal with LPR and DPR.
I wanted to clarify your position.
Yes.
Because it seems like there's a lot of confusion, so it's good to clarify. You do support...
This will not clarify my position. In the eyes of people...
Wait, blocking a canal is now a dam? Oh yeah, it wasn't a dam? They didn't blow up any dam? I don't think they blew up a dam. It was a canal, wasn't it? They blocked the canal.
People who want to say that I'm like anti-Ukraine, people are still going to fucking yell at me.
But you said that...
I disagree. Water was needed mainly for Russian military bases in Crimea. Wait, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this. We can talk about it another time, but we can talk about it another time.
You believe what America's doing in Ukraine is right.
I just want to get through this before I start the Hoi 4 game because I don't want to miss this.
Yell at me.
But you said that you believe what America's doing in Ukraine is right.
I believe that Ukraine has a right to emancipation. What America should do in Ukraine is offer security commitments and assurances, and you can only get that by arriving at a table where you don't fucking destroy the bargain.
Wait, so he does want to give them... This is actually would be a very positive development in my mind for a second. So he does want to give them some sort of security assurance. So what would that be? NATO membership? Or would that be America declaring that if they were to get invaded again, we would defend them? I want to know what he means by security assurances, because we gave them security assurances in the Budapest memorandum, and that didn't do anything because nothing was like enshrined. It was just like, sure, we'll come, and it was just our word, and that's it.
bargaining chips, and instead allowed the original security commitments to continue.
I don't know what you mean by that. You mean
So
at the table with
Ukrainian
Russia?
envoys and Russian envoys got together in Antalya and put a 15-point security plan together as they were negotiating the terms of a
You're saying
ceasefire
Ukraine and
agreement.
Russia, we need to get them, and I mean that it's not that easy. I would
The
assume.
15-point plan fell apart. It was in very, very early stages of negotiation. And people talk about like Boris Johnson, like sabotaging it. I think Hasan himself has said that nonsense before. This was at the same time period when mass graves were being uncovered in a lot of occupied territory that was getting liberated. Bucha, it was around that same time period as well. And the more and more of these crimes that were getting uncovered, and the more Russia was showing that it wasn't nearly as strong as it actually was, that's when the negotiations really, I think, started to fall apart. And then Russia and Ukraine really kind of dug in their heels. Because if Ukraine is pushing back the Russians from their capital and everything they're uncovering is just mass grave here, mass grave there, they're going to be thinking, A, the Russians are not nearly strong as we thought they were. We're never going to get another chance like this. And B, if we were to allow them to keep our territory, they're going to do what they did here everywhere, and it's going to be like that permanently.
Soon.
Well, there was moves that were being made to arrive at that.
Seems like Putin, as
like a year ago,
he's kind of like a fascist leader, is
yes, Putin's interests are
take the whole thing.
Putin's interests certainly are nationalistic. There's obviously material benefits to Ukraine because Ukraine would be a competitor to Russia as far as like oil and gas.
You think the Ukrainians should go to the table and make concessions to the Russians?
I think that Ukrainians went to the table and made concessions to the Russians originally, and it was actually a very clever move by Zelensky to, like, for example,
is he going to say it again, or has he learned? I actually don't know.
Push the Crimean referendum 15 years down the line in order to not deliberate on that aspect right now, because Ukrainians want Crimea back as well. They want LPR and DPR to be Ukrainian. And Zelensky knew that that was going to be an impossible thing to deal with, because he's right now, on the one hand, you have
what would Hasan say? Like, if let's run out a scenario here quick, because I want to be able to like check back at this in a few years, right? Depending on how this goes, if we get the way Hasan wants it, what would Hasan do if we gave Ukraine I don't know what a security assurance is, but what if we did all this, that we did Minsk 3, and then it failed, and then 3-4 years later the Russians just invade again, but this time they have less ground to cover because they conquered land last time, and now they can build upon those gains. Because Russia has sent the message, oh, we can stand up to the entirety of the West, which has economies put together 20 times the size of us. California alone can compete with Russia economically when it comes to the size. We can fight basically the entirety of Europe and America, and we can win or stand our ground. Certainly, if we were more prepared, it would go better next time. And if the West lost their resolve in 2 years or 3 years, depending on when this plan would come to fruition, certainly they wouldn't be willing just a few years later to do this all over again. What would Hasan's conclusion? How would Hasan then say, okay, there is no compromise? Obviously, we have to push them completely out. This seems like the only security guarantee. Because if we allow the Russians to have the territory they currently control permanently, we enshrine that, like Ukraine, like there's so many other problems that are going to come with that. And we've already talked about Ukrainian shipping is probably permanently fucked if the Russians continue what they have been continuing for the last 8 years, right? And Minsk 3 is like Minsk 1 and 2. The occupied territory is going to be a hellscape. The Ukrainian economy is probably permanently crippled. More and more Ukrainians are going to probably leave the country. And the demographic crisis is only going to get worse, as they not only have Ukrainians leaving, but many are basically stolen in occupation. That's not even talking about the kids that are being stolen. So, but let's say that we enshrine all that, and then the Russians violate it again. At that point, is he going to be like, okay, third time wasn't the charm. I tap. We should give the Ukrainians everything necessary to liberate their country. Is there any point that we could reach where Hasan's going to say, actually, you know what? I think liberation is the only answer, as it was in Algeria's case, as it was in Vietnam's case, as it was in the case of many other anti-colonial struggles.
You have Ukrainians with interest in emancipation, ridding the Russian scourge from their borders. and taking back all of their territory from Russia, which includes Crimea as well. So he has a delicate balance where he has to make sure that those guys are not pissed off and overthrow him, and then or that America somehow gets involved and overthrows him, while simultaneously ending the war.
I'm assuming where people get mad at you is just the suggestion that Ukraine should make concessions to an aggressive fascist invader. Because, as we know, European fascist invaders, people often wonder,
they don't stop.
If we didn't make concessions to Hitler, would the war have happened? People wonder that.
Or that we could have stopped them earlier on and saved a bunch of lives. Because this is the fear amongst Ukrainians. It's the idea that we stop it now, give the Russians time to prepare, and kick the can down the road. And then all you're doing is passing this bloody, bloody struggle to another generations of Ukrainians. And now the Ukrainians that are right now, the Ukrainian 12, 13, 14-year-olds that are being scarred for life, living under bombardment, are going to have to be the same ones, hardened through a childhood of war to fight an adulthood of war. That's what happened in 2014 to now. Certainly don't want to experience it again.
Yeah, there's a difference of there's a difference of talking pre-World War II and post-World War II, because we do have mutually assured nuclear destruction.
I was about to say, unfortunately the nukes change all the calculus with that.
So that's the difference there, and that's
I don't know how the nukes change the calculus in Ukraine's space, in Ukraine's place. We've done this before with no nuclear war. The Soviets and the Chinese did it in Vietnam's case, and it humiliated us in Vietnam's case. And that was over 10 years, and that's with American soldiers dying on the ground. We had to take the L, pack up, and leave. We did it to the Soviets in Afghanistan. Well, us in China. People don't talk about China participating and supporting the Mujahideen. But it was us in China that supported the Mujahideen. And what did the Soviets eventually have to do? They had to take the L and leave. Two nuclear powers having to take the L to two states that are significantly less powerful than Ukraine is right now when we talk about its standing military. And two movements that took many, many more losses and were in a much worse position originally at this point in the war, in both cases, whether it be Vietnam's case or definitely in Afghanistan's case. The first 1 year, 2 years of the war, they were not controlling 80% of their country, the Mujahideen.
That's a very significant one, because Article 5 dictates that any kind of NATO nation that Russia...
Because if this was us crossing into Russia and we were conquering Russia, then yes, I would say, okay, nuclear weapon, obviously, nuclear weapons, they're going to launch, we should avoid that at all costs, shouldn't do that, it's horrible. But is the standard we're going to set is that nuclear armed power invades non-nuclear armed power, and in this case, it's especially cynical because Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. Nuclear armed power invades non-nuclear armed power, fails on every level, to the point where that non-nuclear armed power's allies could support them to push out the other power completely. But instead we don't, because the other power decided to be a suicide bomber on a geopolitical level and basically say, we'll blow up the world if you don't let us erase the Ukrainians from occupied territory. We're setting a new standard for how we deal with nuclear arms control. Well, how would this not lead to every tin pot dictator and genocidal maniac rushing to get nukes because they just learned that they can invade anyone they want as long as they threaten to kill everyone? The thing that stops the Russians from killing anyone, and the reason why when you listen to the nuclear statements of government officials and not state media talking heads, it's almost always along the lines of, we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons if our territorial integrity is threatened, yada, yada, yada. It's all stuff that is still in line with Russia's pre-existing nuclear doctrine, which would have never suggest that they would use a nuke in the case that they're in right now. I don't think that the nuclear arms control angle has been properly thought out by many people.
Tries to attack, okay, because NATO was developed against Russia, USSR, communism. It was an anti-communist institution in of itself. Immediately means that all other nations, according to Article 5, are drawn into war with a nuclear superpower like Russia.
Right.
So there's a difference. Plus, one other aspect of this is that Russia kind of showed its ass and its capabilities and where those capabilities end as far as ground war goes, which is the reason why you see Finland and Sweden, which previously had long-held neutrality, not like direct agreements, but long-held neutrality. I wouldn't say treaties because it's not an official treaty, but just like didn't join NATO,
An understanding.
immediately join NATO. Why? Because they realized they don't have any fucking power. What are they going to do? Go to Finland? Get the fuck out of here. They can't take over Ukraine. They said it was going to be a day. They suck. They don't have the power.
So also, I don't know the exact name of it, but I know Ukraine surrendered their nuclear weapons, which is one of the best.
But let's reflect for a moment. Just because Russia was incompetent at the start of the invasion doesn't mean that Russia can't learn brutal lessons. The Russian military, through blood and iron of this war, through wave after wave of armed thugs being sent into the front line. And when I say that, I mean that literally. Wagner prison recruitment was very high, was very frequent. They have learned valuable military lessons, how to integrate drones, for how to manage their logistics better. How they've learned through harsh combat. They've been integrating jamming technology much more effectively on the front line. They have been learning through combat and improving. That isn't to say that they're exactly the best military in the world. They still have tons of problems. A lack of morale, low training for a lot of the new recruits because they're kind of like rushing them to the front line out of fear of the front line collapsing under the force of the counteroffensive. They've got problems with shell shortages. They've got problems with rocket shortages. They've got problems with the fact that they don't have enough modern equipment or having to rely on a lot of like old 1950s, 1960s equipment, which still work, but they're certainly not as good as the modern gear. They've got problems. Corruption is still an issue, even if it isn't as bad as it was at the start of the war. As far as we know, there isn't people literally selling the gasoline out of tanks anymore. They are learning. And this isn't the first thing to happen to Russia. This isn't the first time to happen to Russia, even in modern history. I mean, this is the Soviet Union. It's a little different, but the Soviets invade Finland, absolutely incompetent, fail on every level. Germany invade, but then they fix up their forces, try again, learn their lessons, have better command, and then they succeed. Same thing. Germany invades Soviet Union. Soviet Union gets clobbered left, right, and center. Learn lessons, rebuild, adapt, and then win. And then they beat the Germans. So I don't want to get this message from anyone that, well, if the Russians have failed so brutally in Ukraine's case, that means that there's probably not going to be a problem from them in the future. They've still been able to take Ukrainian land, so they could still try to take Ukrainian land again, and they could continue to try to continue these reforms and divert more and more resources into the military. They've increased military spending by 100 to 200%. That is having an impact. And that will have an impact over the long term. So if the Russians really get a one-tracked mind and it's just, we will conquer Ukraine either today or tomorrow, and then go beyond that, they could try. Could they conquer Finland? Right now, as part of NATO? Probably not. Moldova? I mean, that's a lot more reasonable. Not reasonable, but a lot more realistic.
Best things you can hope.
Worst things you could do: never give up the nukes.
But like in terms of like a humanistic, a political move, it's bad. But like as a humanistic thing, that's
yeah. I mean, obviously we should get rid of nukes. Yeah.
Some say Ukraine had no way of utilizing those nukes because like the control mechanism was in the USSR, so in Moscow. But
they could have invested into it to retrofit it and make it so they could control it. But it would have been an incredibly expensive project at a period where they just did not have a gigantic budget. I mean, come on. Right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine wasn't exactly swimming in cash. That's something that's not often talked about when they talk about them giving up their nukes, and everyone says, foolish Ukrainians, they just gave up their nukes. I mean, most Ukrainians right now are saying they should have kept the nukes for obvious reasons, but at the time, it was not that, financially smart.
But you still shouldn't have given your nuclear stockpile.
So your point is that they should never have done that.
No. I think we'd be looking at a very different world if, for Ukrainians at least, if
with the benefit of hindsight. How could you say that? I mean, I don't think they would get invaded right now if they had nukes, right? I mean,
well,
if you have nukes, you don't get invaded. That's just kind of how it works.
Anyway, we made a guarantee to them that you give up your nukes and we'll got your back. And so I do feel like that's a pretty important agreement to uphold. I mean,
What?
what?
You're talking about American promises to Ukraine in exchange for
They're surrendering their nukes.
surrendering their nukes.
Yeah, America never like actually followed through on any of their promises. America's still not following technically their promises of defending Ukraine. They're just giving Ukrainians weapons. Ukraine is currently
That's not. We didn't say we were going to defend Ukraine with. We didn't specify what we were going to do. We said we would support them and we would help them in that type of situation. There was never like we will have troops on the ground to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity. We never specified. It was never clarified in the document what exactly that support would manifest in. That's how the Obama administration wiggled out of sending Ukraine really much of anything to support it outside of, I think it was counter battery artillery, meaning they could see the bombs as they're falling on their city. Congratulations. You can see the things before they kill you. But, I mean, I would say that we are now, as of right now, with their aid, more, I would say more in the spirit of the Budapest Memorandum, fulfilling our requirements. But I hear a lot of people that seemingly want to go back on our word.
sitting in a very unique
When I
position.
say a lot of people, I mean a lot of people on the internet. The majority of Americans still support aid. The majority of Europeans still support aid. But man, is it a loud, loud minority.
That I see happen in the same cycle of violence in the Middle East all the fucking time. America goes to a militant group and says, hey, we're going to give you weapons, you want autonomy, specifically Kurds, right?
You think
Which
every country should have a nuclear bomb?
I think every country
citizen should
in
have
this
one.
current...
Every citizen of America?
Yeah,
That's Tim Pool's-
I think
that's
in the
Tim
current
Pool's position.
formation, if you have a nation state, you have to have a fucking nuke. Otherwise, America will come and fuck you up.
This is such a dangerous idea. I mean, think about how many times the United States lost nukes in a bush. We lost a nuke in a bush once in France. We would do like we lose. There are nukes that we lost. We don't know where they are from during the Cold War. They're just probably at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. The idea that the whole world has to get nukes or America will invade you. Because we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, there's over like 190 countries. We just physically couldn't pull that off even if we wanted to. There is an end to the endless coffers that is given to the military-industrial complex. If every single state raced to get nuclear weapons, that is a nuclear catastrophe waiting to happen, even if it's purely from human error. Do we really think that every single country in the world is going to be safe and effective in managing a nuclear arsenal? We haven't even been that particularly safe and effective. What about the countries that have unbelievably rampant corruption? The ones that sell weapons out of storehouses? I don't know, it just seems a little dangerous to me, every single country having a button that could blow up the world. I want to pursue denuclearization, personally.
So you think every nation should
Hey, is that a more... nah, never mind. I don't want to be that cheeky.
have a nuclear
I think
program?
either every nation has a nuke or none of them have it. And I would obviously want none of the
Oh, there we go.
nations to have it.
But less
Which
is
is why I
better.
was in support of the Iranian denuclearization agreement. I thought that was good, which, you know, Donald Trump fucked up.
Oops.
I believe an individual citizen in this country has a right to own.
Do you believe
a
every
nuclear
person should
weapon.
have a nuclear bomb? That's
Yes.
the socialist vision of
Yes, I think everyone should have a nuclear bomb.
I mean, that's the only equality that we can really... Everyone should have a nuclear silo in their garage. So, okay, in short, you support Ukraine. What the Allied...
Is that real? That's the short... That's the in-short conclusion? Is that really the in-short conclusion?
powers are doing to support them is right.
No, because America's interest in Ukraine is not one that is genuine. America's interest in Ukraine is just
I don't
fucking
care about
withering.
the interest. I don't
No, but that's
care.
Okay, here's a question. When we were embargoing the Japanese from American oil, was all of that just purely out of interest of the humanitarian struggle of the Chinese people? I feel like we're playing like on the playground here. We're playing make-believe about geopolitics. All nation states engage in geopolitics to benefit their own interests. That's not necessarily bad. And you can do something that benefits you, that also benefits other parties and is the right thing to do. If I was to go to the store and buy something, right, out of my own selfish interest, it could also be in the interest of the seller. There could be multiple parties that benefit and make it a good thing to do. Ukraine benefits, we benefits, all of Europe benefits. The only party that doesn't benefit is the Russians the imperialist invader? Whether or not all of our interests are pure, I think is not really a point against supporting the Ukrainians, unless he can prove those impure interests are going to lead to worse circumstances down the line.
About America's interest. I'm asking what you think.
Because no, America's interest in Ukraine is incredibly important.
What do you think is the right thing to do in Ukraine?
I told you what I think the right thing to do.
Then I
is.
asked to clarify, and you said no.
Instead of fucking up the deal, instead of
no, his solution is negotiate. That is his solution. He didn't say how the negotiations necessarily go, what should necessarily be given up. He just basically said land should be given up in a Minsk III type situation. We should use the model that has been proven to fail on already 2 other occasions. That's his position. Because he thinks that the liberation struggle is a pointless, like trog in the mud, and it's stalemating, and all it's going to lead is to more death and destruction. That's his position.
Fucking up the deal that Ukraine had with Russia by Boris Johnson fucking showing up in the middle of that, going to Kyiv directly.
Dude,
This is just a lie, man. It's not a lie that Boris Johnson went there, but it is a lie that he fucked up the deal. This isn't even like the story about him fucking off the deal is from a Pravda article from a secondary source, and all it really says is that Boris Johnson expressed to Ukrainian leadership that he didn't trust the Russians and he didn't think they should make a deal. That doesn't mean that they made the decision solely based on the advice of Boris Johnson. This is the same period when mass graves were beginning uncovered across the whole country. Politically offering up more territory to the Russians. Politically giving them more and more concessions of your land, which is what they were demanding. They were demanding the rest of the Donbas. When you're actively uncovering mass graves across the country, and they're saying that Ukraine doesn't really exist, and they're fighting a war of national annihilation. Yeah, that type of war is going to change your opinion on whether you can even negotiate with them on a settlement at that period. No, they couldn't. They didn't believe it. It wasn't just Boris Johnson going there, the Ukrainians with no autonomy getting sabotaged by him, telling them this is what you have to do. There's no proof that all it is a secondary, not even a primary source, it's a secondary source of an anonymous government official on the Pravda article saying that Boris Johnson went there and encouraged them that not to negotiate with this fool. He's not trustworthy. He's not a trustworthy negotiating partner. He didn't make them scuttle it. The Ukrainians decided to pull out of it themselves after no progress was being made, and due to Russia's own actions on the battlefield, the negotiations felt quite disingenuous. It's really weird to hear, yeah, we care about peace, we care about a peaceful settlement, as you're uncovering mass graves.
Do you think what's happening there is right? If not, why?
Do I think what's happening?
Allied
you
power.
ask me a question, I answer it, and then you move on to something different.
No, because I asked you.
I'm telling you what I want.
That Allied powers is what they're doing there right. You said no, but I just got done having this whole conversation where you said yeah.
I think what the Allied powers are doing, as far as giving weapons to Ukraine with no end in sight, because they see it as a great way to fucking great way to
see. I think Hasan loves narratives more than he likes simple narratives very much. Because for him, it's easy. America's involved in this purely because they want to fuck the Russians. And wanting to fuck the Russians for fuck the Russians' sake is bad. Therefore, we shouldn't send weapons to the liberation struggle because that's all America cares about. Number one, that simplifies America's interests. It also simplifies why people in the United States support sending over weapons to Ukraine. It doesn't only simplify it, it dumbs it down. It removes a lot of the nuance. But it also suggests that all that matters is whether or not if a country is looking out for their own interests or they're doing things out of some selfish desire. If that's the case, then they shouldn't do it. But what if it benefits the world? What if it was a selfish desire for a country to fight against the Germans? What if somebody, for selfish reason, wanted to sell weapons to the Allies to fight the Germans? Is that a bad thing? Should we not buy their weapons then because they wanted to do it for profit? Do you think when the Vietnamese, and I'll make this comparison to him because he's a communist. Do you think when the Vietnamese were getting weapons from the Soviets or the Chinese, they were doing it out the pure love and affection of their heart? What do you think they had certain national interests at play? Selfish interests at play.
Continue the harm done to a weak Russia that they can simultaneously claim is like really fucking powerful is only going to continue this war rather than try to fucking implement security commitments and get to a unilateral agreement or a bilateral agreement where and not just fucking Russia and Ukraine, but like bring China to the table and put an end, like do a ceasefire and put an end to this war is infinitely better for Ukraine and Ukrainian development, Ukrainian economy.
How does he know that? Now, I would like to hear him. I would like to hear Hasan in detail, or any detail. I would like to hear just a single word on how Ukraine giving up 80% of its coastline is going to be beneficial for the economy. How Minsk 3, when Minsk 2 and 1 failed and led to a frozen conflict that made investors not want to invest in the country, that was economically horrific for the nation, how that's going to revitalize the Ukrainian economy. There was a report recently, one second, actually, let me bring this up, because I think he has no clue. I don't think he's ever looked into it. Like, how would the Ukrainian economy be affected if 20% of their territory and 80% of their coastline and their ability to ship grain by water is eliminated? One second, let me look this up. Because I remember there was this report recently that I thought was absolutely fantastic because it lays out the exact scenario he's talking about and how it would affect the Ukrainian economy. Good Times, Bad Times just did a really good piece on it.
Літня спека в українських степах не
No, this one. Here's the report.
To its fate, when and how the war will end. This variable was the starting point for the authors of the report by the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, who presented two scenarios, positive and negative, for the Ukrainian economy in the coming year. Starting with the negative, it assumes that hostilities will continue, but their active phase will end in early 2024.
What he's talking about right now, this 2024 end, the active phase ending, this would be the Minsk 3, some negotiated, maybe short-term, long-term, who knows, ceasefire.
It assumes that a ceasefire will
So this is basically a ceasefire coming right after the counteroffensive ends, right? So this is Hasan's basically best-case scenario.
Established and later broken by attacks on critical infrastructure or civilians. The lift end in early. It assumes that hostilities will continue, but their active phase will end in early 2024. It assumes that a ceasefire will be established and later broken by attacks on critical infrastructure or civilians. The lifting of martial law, which according to the scenario under discussion would occur in such a situation, will lead to a mass emigration of young men. The labor market will experience a drastic demand for skilled labor, which it will not be able to meet. Industry will focus on manufacturing for the military, while other sectors will suffer chronic shortages of finance, labor, or investment. Foreign investor confidence will remain very low due to further terrorist attacks by the Kremlin. On the other hand, if there is no territorial change, Ukraine will remain severely cut off from the sea, and maritime transport will remain very expensive and risky due to mined ports. In the negative scenario, the authors also assume that Western aid will gradually disappear. As a result,
Which, by the way, if we were to sign a ceasefire agreement with the Ukrainians, and we were to do the scenario that he is talking about, it would almost certainly start to peter out, because there's no way the West wouldn't be like, I guess my job is done. Hero, away!
economy will sink into increasing misery, which together with the stalemate on the front line, will contribute to social discontent and even protests. If an economic crisis was to hit the world at the same time, Ukraine would be even more vulnerable to its effects. The positive scenario, on the other hand, involves the liberation of the occupied territories. Naturally, this would lead to the recovery of lost growth in these areas and the development of maritime export opportunities. The scenario assumes that significant foreign financial assistance would continue to be provided, more than $30 billion per year. Significant investment related to the Ukraine's reconstruction project would also contribute to growth. This in turn would create hundreds of thousands of jobs and encourage the return of millions of migrants. In this scenario, the economy would grow at a rate of up to 10 to 15% of GDP per year, quickly closing the post-war gap. It should be noted, however, that the report's authors consider the probability of this scenario to be low. Assuming all this, however, it is essential to take a few steps back and look at the issue from a broader perspective. A loss of 30% of GDP in one.
Okay, there's one more thing to talk about in the video. I don't want to just steal his content too much, okay? There's one last thing I want to say that the video talks about and the report talks about specifically, even though the video didn't get too deep into it. And is that if Ukraine was to go through the path where its maritime routes are basically fucked, that investors are scared to invest because most likely there are going to be continued Russian attacks even through a ceasefire. Now, maybe Hasan trusts the Russians. I don't know. From how he's talked about on this show, I assume he understands that they haven't been very trustworthy during these talks and during negotiations previously, and there's no real good reason to assume that they would uphold this agreement. But I just want to say that even if the Russians wanted to uphold the agreement, I think there's a chance that they wouldn't. If you look at Russian military culture at this point, it has a complete disregard for civilian casualties and a complete disregard in how they damage and destroy the country while they're in it. I've seen it firsthand in how they shell evacuation operations, shell civilians, shell civilian infrastructure, and they do it systematically across basically the entire country. And so someone would have to convince me that not only will the Russians keep their word, but that culture will be held back by the Russian government. So the Russian government will be there to punish those who violate the agreement. That they'll go out there and they'll arrest people who volunteered to fight. The ultra-nationalists, the Rusich neo-Nazis, the prisoners, the literal murderers and rapists they've given machine guns to. I'm not saying it's 100% impossible, but you're really like, I mean, I don't know, I've been playing a lot of Baldur's Gate, man. You better be rolling a nat 20 and have the best luck.
Ukrainian citizens not fucking dying senselessly under a artillery shelling campaign that's literally happening. You know what's really fucking insane about this? Russia is getting artillery shells from North Korea, and America is America's telling South Korea to give artillery shells to Ukraine. It's fucking nuts. Both sides are just fucking shelling each other.
Shells.
But it's so stupid.
Who's gonna
Ukraine
make
is
the
now
shells?
also using.
It's so stupid that we're giving them weapons to fight. Why is it stupid? Why is it? It's war in and of itself is bad. But war is an extension of politics, right? What was the philosopher who said that? I don't know. It's pretty basic. War is an extension of politics. And if the Ukrainians want their liberation, it's not just going to be given to them. It was Clausewitz? Yeah, it was Clausewitz.
Depleted uranium as well on its own fucking soil.
Okay,
that
so
is going to have
your
damaging
position
implications.
Is that
That's
the
going to have
Allies
damaging.
helping Ukraine is good, but that Ukraine needs to be more willing to make concessions to
Not just
Russia.
Ukraine. Allies need to be more willing to some in certain instances even push Ukraine to make understandable concessions.
What are the concessions Russia will that Hasan will demand of Russia? I would like to hear that. What are the demands that we need to make of Russia? Because I assume that Hasan's whole plan isn't just go to Ukraine and say, give the Russians this, 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 and this, and this, and this, and this. There has to be something that we ask of the Russians, right? What would be Hasan's list for the Russians? There's been very little talk about what the invading imperialist occupier is going to have to give up. It seems to mostly just be about what the Ukrainians are going to give up. And what if we go to the negotiating table and the Russians just say, no, this isn't enough? Because the Russians right now are in a very politically difficult position. I mean, Putin's at least concerned about the ultra-nationalists in his country who are telling him that he's not fighting the war, at least not his administration is not fighting the war effectively enough, not killing enough Ukrainians. What if he goes to them and say, hey, we froze the contact line, we did it, all the Nazis are gone. And they're like, what do you mean? Kharkiv's still in their control, Odessa's still in their control, Zaporozhye's still in their control, the city of Kherson is still in their control, all these cities and towns that speak Russian. What if he comes to the conclusion that the West is weak? They're asking us to come to the negotiating table. You know, the administration of Hasan Abi doesn't want to send weapons anymore. Sentiment is growing against it, in their mind at least. We don't want to negotiate. You're going to have to give us more land, or we're going to take more land. What if they make demands that the Ukrainians are not willing to accept? I want to know if there's a scenario where the Ukrainians come to President Hasan and say they're asking for all the territory they hold, everything. That's cities that we know that our people want us to liberate. Not only are they asking for that, Hasan, they're asking for even more. They're asking for more, Hasan, more than that. They're asking for Kharkiv. They're asking for Odessa. They're asking for us to demilitarize. We can never accept these demands. And by the way, those are the current Russian demands. What if they just say, no, we're digging our heels in? Will Hasan then say, okay, I guess we have to send more weapons to the Ukrainians? Or does he cut them off and say, sorry, you got to accept all their demands. Give the Russians everything they want.
Because
Like
the
giving
idea...
Anamarchy, I see him in chat. I'm sorry, we're supposed to be playing Hearts of Iron, but Hasan, man, Hasan.
Land.
What?
Like giving up land.
Not giving
It's
up
almost done, I swear.
land. No, it's not giving up land. But
That's what-
pushing a
that's what
referendum
Putin wants.
15...
Wait, not giving up land. Let me hear. Wait. Did he just say not giving up land? So he doesn't want the Ukrainians to give up land. Let's listen.
concessions because
Like
the
giving
idea...
up land.
What?
Like giving up land.
Not giving up
Like they-
land. No, it's not giving up land. But
That's what-
pushing a
that's what Putin
referendum
wants.
15 years into the future for Crimea is a really solid middle of the ground approach that Zelensky's own team actually put forward, which I thought was great.
Do you think
Is Hasan under the assumption that if Zelensky was to send Putin like a Gmail, like a mail, like an email, and said, okay, just give us all the other land back, but we'll put Crimea off into a referendum, that would be an acceptable deal to them? The Russians want to keep everything they have and get more. They have declared time and time again that they will not compromise on the Donbas, that they want to capture all of it. And for the start of this year, I mean, the entirety of the Bakhmut operation, which was a horrifically just deadly and grinding and attritional slugfest, where the Russians lost so much. The whole reason they fought for it, even though it wasn't that strategically important, is it was, even though they threw so many lives away, the reason they did it is because it was a stepping stone to conquer the Donbas. Why would the Russians accept a deal where they give up all this land that they've just thrown so many men at?
things so?
If he doesn't want the Ukrainians to make territorial concessions, which I assume would mean the Ukrainians getting back everything but Crimea, which he wants to have a referendum on, or going back to 2014 lines, how does the Russian public interpret that as anything else than a failure? And how does Putin's regime sell that to the Russian public?
Zelensky's a provocateur.
If he wants them to accept the deal, then you also need to think from their perspective as well. Not just what's the most aesthetically pleasing deal.
No. What?
Oh shit! I have a doctor's appointment.
What the fuck? Wait,
Oh, I'm just asking because that's a position. I'm not saying that you ever said that. What?
you said it like I've said it.
No. I was just getting your opinion on it. Just because I've heard people say that, and I was just doing. I was just checking your opinion on it.
No,
What
I think
time is it at, Lena?
it's at 2.
That's my last part, though. Basically,
No, I don't think Zelensky is a provocateur. What?
like a bad faith actor.
No, I think Zelensky is certainly a self-interested politician who definitely wants emancipation.
Self-interest, literally. Yeah, meaning his. Well, anyway.
Yeah, no, he wants Russia to no longer have control over Ukrainian territories, which is perfectly reasonable. He also has to strike a delicate balance because, as I correctly pointed out when the invasion first happened, whenever an irredentist or imperialist power makes a move on another nation, you embolden some of the most reactionary forces, and they are seen as liberators because in that moment they are the liberators. The ones who have the violent means to push back are going to be seen as protectors. That only grows nationalistic, hyper-nationalistic sentiment, and that is never productive. That is never good. That's not good for workers' rights. That's not good for future prospects of Ukraine. And I think that blowback, who knows what's going to happen, but is
Look, if I want to be blunt, the scenario that is most scary to me when he talks about the hyper-nationalism in Ukraine is a scenario where Zelensky says, fine, we'll give you whatever is necessary for peace. And that would most likely be, at this point, if we were to cave to the Russians in any way to make them accept the deal right now, which seems to be what Hasan wants, it would mean they get to hold on to, at the very least, what they hold right now. Unless there is a significant change on the battlefield, like a breakthrough in Zaporozhye. Maybe that could change the dynamics in some way, which is why I really hope there is a breakthrough there. What is good? God, this whole conversation is frustrating.
It's never good. It's not good for workers' rights.
In that scenario where the Ukrainians give that up, that is the scenario where I'm most scared about ultra-nationalist backlash. Because you think all these soldiers that went out east and fought this liberation struggle are going to, many of whom are fighting literally to take back their own homes, which are still in occupied territory, which would then be signed away in these deals, their own families divided from them. Do you think they're just gonna be like, okay, that's not the impression I got from the Ukrainian people from Euromaidan. That's not the interpretation I got from them from the Orange Revolution in 2004. That could be a situation where, honestly, it gets much worse, because we've seen that the Ukrainian people are certainly willing to get on the streets, and they're certainly willing to get physical to defend their interests.
That's not good for future prospects of Ukraine. And I think that blowback, who knows what's going to happen, but is terrifying.
I have to leave, bro.
All right.
But it's 1:30. I thank you for going so long. How long have we been going?
No, you know who needs.
Okay, I'm done. I'm done. I got nothing else to say. I mean, his takes are bad. That's nothing new. Some of these takes just seem silly. Some of them just seem uneducated. I don't think he really knows anything about the Ukrainian economy. I don't think he really knows anything about the shelling during that period. And that's why I think he avoided the questions. I don't really have anything else to say. He doesn't support Russia, but I don't think his logic adds up. Okay, that is enough of that. We are not covering apparently any news today because that went on for a while. Jesus Christ.
Is occurred.